The UK could and should have negotiated an exit mechanism to the controversial Irish backstop. That's according to the former Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab. It is the issue that could sink Theresa May's deal in the House of Commons because it cost her the support of the DUP and many of her own backbenchers. Mr Raab gave us some new insight into what really happened in those negotiations with Brussels when he was Brexit Secretary, so let's have a listen. I started by asking what should happen if the Prime Minister fails to get her deal through Parliament.
We need to see what happens in the scale of the vote, but I think if, as expected, the deal is voted down, and it's very clear, and I suspect it will be, I think it's important that we change direction. This deal will have been rejected. It could still be remedied if the EU were willing to look again, particularly at the backstop, and particularly making clear that we had transitioned to a free trade agreement, not this sort of hybrid of a customs union and single market.
The EU have been absolutely clear that this is not only the best deal on the table, it's the only deal on the table. I mean, you were Brexit Secretary and you didn't manage to get them to drop the backstop, so it's fancy politics, isn't it?
Well, of course, the EU would say that right now. They want this deal to pass because it is incredibly good terms for the EU. It is also a lousy deal for the United Kingdom, and I have had 4.5 months' experience negotiating with the EU, and I think it's very clear they will not want to see no deal. That is now a much higher possibility, even possibly probability.
So how do you know that then? Is the conversations that you were having as Brexit Secretary? Or?
Well, I knew from my time, as I've written in the Sunday Telegraph today, that there were moments in the negotiation where we could have pressed harder on the backstop, particularly around the exit mechanism. Now, the EU hung tough, and I'm afraid we just weren't firm enough about that. It's always harder to go back in a negotiation, so I'm not saying it would be easy, but I certainly wouldn't give up. And ultimately, if we go back and the EU continue to rebuff the perfectly reasonable proposals we're making, we do need to be willing to contemplate and prepare for leaving on WTO terms.
You say that there were moments that you could have pushed harder. You were Brexit Secretary, so that's on you, isn't it?
Well, partly, but we're a team, and of course the officials led the technical groups. The Prime Minister ultimately was in the lead, and I give my advice, and it's either taken or it's not taken.
So it wasn't taken?
Well, I do want to be careful because, you know, I respect the fact that there's a hierarchy, but the idea that we couldn't have negotiated a better deal, I'm afraid, is not my experience. We should have been firmer, clearer, and taken a more robust line back in July. And I think actually there's a lesson for the negotiations, which they probably should have been conducted. The end game of the negotiations should have been politically led, not led by the technical teams. And I certainly made that argument at the time.
So just to sort of pin you down, what did the EU say to you? What did Michel Barnier say to you that made you think that there was any movement at all on the backstop?
Well, you could see this backstop issue coming down the line. It was obvious. It wasn't a shock or a surprise. I made clear it would need to be time-limited and finite. And Michel Barnier at one point in one of our meetings said, I understand it needs to be short. But I'm afraid after that, the technical track for the negotiations took it in another direction. And I was very clear with the Prime Minister that we should have stood firm at that point, and that was back in July. Now, I'm not suggesting it's easy to go back. You lose moments in negotiation. You can't just claw them back. What I am suggesting is that there is probably more flexibility than is being suggested, and actually we should have taken a robust line then. We certainly should be taking one now.
At the same time, though, are you not worried that by voting down this deal, you're risking either no Brexit or a much softer Brexit? I mean, look at the votes in the House of Commons in the last week. That made pretty clear that actually the House of Commons wants to wrestle back control of the Brexit, and if that happens, then it's more likely to be a Norway-style option or even a second referendum.
Well, I'm not sure that Parliament can wrestle back control. It needs to pass legislation if it wants to stop us leaving the EU at the end of March 2019. A resolution isn't legally binding. It has political impact, but it's not legally binding. And to be honest with you, this deal is the worst of all the alternatives. There
Worse than Norway?
Well, it's nip and tuck. Actually, Norway probably is a bit worse. You lose even more control over your laws and you lose control over immigration. But the truth is, I'm not going to choose between various evils. I want a good positive, optimistic Brexit, and I think we can still turn it around.
So this deal is worse than remaining in the EU then, in your...
I certainly think in terms, I mean, I've said before, I think if you look at the amount of control we lose over our laws because we wouldn't have any say in how they're made, I think in that respect it is certainly worse than membership. But I wouldn't be making the case for reversing Brexit and going back into the EU. We need to make a success of Brexit and move forward.
You've said before that the EU had been bullying and blackmailing. What surprises me is that the way that the EU behaved should have come as any surprise to you. Of course they want to protect their national interests. Do you think Brexiteers like yourself were a bit naive going into all this?
No, not so much naive. I was very surprised in particular about the way the Northern Ireland was treated. And you would hear swirling around in Brussels, particularly the people around Selmayr and Martin Selmayr in the Commission and some others, that losing Northern Ireland would be the price the UK would pay for Brexit. This was reported to me through the diplomatic channel. There's one thing to defend your interests robustly, but there's another thing in the spirit of so-called European unity to be trying to carve up a major European nation. And it's deeply reckless if you look at the Europeans' own interests, which is the point you made, Sophie. I mean, look at Catalonia, look at the separatist tendencies across Europe, look at Belgium. I mean, this kind of stuff feels to me like politics, a very narrow politics in the Commission, trumping the European, let alone the UK interest.
At the same time, though, it does feel as if it's easy, isn't it, to kind of sit here and point the finger of blame elsewhere, you know, blaming the UK officials or blaming the Prime Minister, blaming the people around Martin Selmayr, for example. Don't you need to take some more responsibility?
Absolutely, and that's why I stepped up to the plate when Chequers came through and said, look, let's try and make a success of it. And I spent 4 to 5 months trying to do that. But at the end of the day, my first responsibility is to my country and my conscience, and this is a very historic moment. And what I fear, and there are a lot of people that are weary with Brexit right now, what I fear is that if we signed this deal, we would immediately then be in a course for trying to revise it, because it would stoke up tensions at home and with the EU. It would just be a thorn in our side. So we will not be able to move on from Brexit unless we deliver a successful Brexit, which is faithful to the referendum, and this deal doesn't do that.
Amber Rudd has given an interview in which she says that the men at Westminster seem to flounce out quite a lot. Everyone is looking for someone to blame, while the only one actually trying to sort it out is the Prime Minister. Who do you think she could be talking about there?
I don't know. Amber does this every now and again. She did it during the referendum when she personalised an attack on Boris. I'm not sure if that's aimed at me. It sounded, frankly, a bit sexist to me. The reality is, I stood up and tried to make it work, but I couldn't in good conscience go to Brussels and sign a deal with Michel Barnier that I feel would be so damaging to the British economy and devastating to our democracy. So I'm not going to engage in any name-calling or personalised attacks on anyone. And I've been very respectful of the Prime Minister. But when push comes to shove, this is about far bigger stuff than personalities. It's about the future of our country.
You say that this deal is damaging to the economy. Others would argue that it's actually the prospect of leaving without a deal that would be damaging to the economy.
Well, there are risks in any course of action we take, but if you look at the short-term disruption that would inevitably be there with a transition without a deal on WTO terms, it's manageable. Many of the risks can be avoided or mitigated. But what is far worse, in my view, is to take a short-term approach and not take on that challenge, and at the expense and at the cost of a much bigger burden, price for the UK economy and our democracy. So the point I would make is, yes, no deal would involve some short-term risks, but they're dwarfed, if you like, by the longer-term risks to our country, to our economy, and to faith in our democracy if we go down that path.
You say short-term risks, but we've had some pretty alarming predictions, haven't we? You know, baby formula milk, for example, needing to be stockpiled, medicines struggling to get through those ports at Dover, 6 months of disruption. I mean, this is more than just risk.
Well, I scrutinised all of those papers, and frankly, I can say now as a backbencher that some of those assumptions are just not credible. So, for example, one of the things that the government's no-deal planning suggests is that every lorry coming through will take 10 minutes to check, that there will only be 2 cabins at protect Calais, and that there will be no attempt by the UK in this worst-case scenario to try and mitigate the risks. Well, that's not a reasonable worst-case assumption. That's a sort of kamikaze worst-case assumption. Of course, we can do it quicker than 10 minutes a lorry. They do 5 minutes a lorry in Switzerland, and of course, we will try and divert some of that flow if the French take a particularly punitive approach to Zeebrugge, to Rotterdam, and some of those other ports. And I don't think those assumptions and those forecasts that have come out from the government recently are remotely credible. And I said that to the officials when I was Secretary of State.
What was their response?
Well, they didn't have a very good one on the facts. I mean, it's not about civil servants versus politicians. I've just asked the question, for example, the French authorities say that they can check a lorry in 2 minutes. So why are we saying that it would take 10 minutes a lorry to check? Why are we defying what the French authorities themselves say they would do? Why are we not also taking into account the things that we can do to mitigate some of that damage and that disruption to flow? So I'm not saying that there wouldn't be some risk and some disruption. There would, but it's far more manageable than is being suggested. And I think just as we saw, take Paul Krugman, former Nobel economist, and no fan of Brexit. He said that the Bank of England forecasts were not serious, and they felt like they were politically motivated. I think there's a lot of this going on, and I don't think the British public are going to be cowed by Project Fear Mark 2.
You've been very critical of some of the projections. You've been very critical about the negotiations. Do you think that the Prime Minister has been a bit of a pushover then?
I'm not going to personalise things, but I've said right from the outset, the government should have taken a far more resolute approach, probably back at the beginning of the negotiations, when you may remember all that wrangling about the sequencing. You need to set out your stall very early on. But when I went in and became Secretary of State in July, even then it was salvageable. So I do think that we have been...
But you didn't salvage it?
Well, no, I could see how the deal could be salvaged. But look, I went in there as Secretary of State, part of a team, and ultimately the Prime Minister was the boss. So I gave my advice, and if it, on many times it was taken, but on crucial decisions which led to the flaws in the deal that I've described around the backstop and around the future relationship, actually we needed to take a more clear and robust approach.
If Theresa May loses on Tuesday, which it looks like she will, does she need to resign?
I think she could still, even in the event of a big loss on the vote, which we expect, I think she could still turn it around. But we need a change of approach. She needs to go back with a, if you like, a best final offer to the EU.
But she's staked everything on this deal. Is it really credible to say that, oh, yes, she can just wash her hands of it, have a completely new approach and stay as Prime Minister?
Well,
She's wedded to the deal.
I think if Parliament has voted the deal down in using the legislative mechanism in the Withdrawal Act that's there, I think she can go and say, look, this deal doesn't work for the United Kingdom, and we need an alternative approach. And I think ultimately we need to be willing to walk away. In any negotiation, whether it's commercial, diplomatic or political negotiation, you need to be able to walk away if you're going to be taken seriously by the other side.
See, the cynic in me can't help but think that by very carefully supporting the Prime Minister like this, you're not really doing your own leadership prospects any harm, are you? I mean, if you came out and attacked the Prime Minister, then it would be difficult for you to be Crown leader, wouldn't it?
Well, you can be a cynic if you like, but I'm an optimist, and I also believe that you can have honest disagreements with people. I've never been the kind of person to take a very personalised approach to politics, but what I put aside all of the political shenanigans going on, I've said at the outset I will be focused on one thing and one thing only, which is this historic crossroads for our country. What is the best course, with risks on all sides?
Can you rule out running for leader?
No, I've always said I wouldn't rule it out, but I'm just not going to get sucked into that debate. I think the public and people watching the show would think it would be very self-indulgent to be engaging in all that speculation. We've got such a big issue up for decision on Tuesday.
If Boris Johnson runs, would you stand aside?
Look, I'm just not getting dragged into it. You can, yeah, I'm sure you've got various variations on the same question, but I'm not getting dragged in.
Thank you very much, Dominic Raab.
Good to see you.